All right, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about the German state that is moving all of their government employees over to open source. So they're using Linux now, or they're going to be using Linux. They're switching everything over to open source. They're going to be getting rid of SharePoint and Word. There's a lot of stuff that goes into this. I'd made a post about this a little while back. There's a lot of aspects to this that could potentially jam things up. We're going to go through all of the background and all of some certain insights that probably wouldn't really be able to find with most of the other videos out there talking about this. So let's go ahead and cover the background to all of this first, because that will make more sense. So some of the people were bringing up, and someone from Germany actually brought up in the comment section on the post that I made about this last week, that this had been tried in the past, and then there were a few points that came up on it. The person that left the comment said they're not going to ditch Microsoft and all of the existing infrastructure and cloud services in the public service. He said, "Why do I know that? Because I work there. I spoke to an IT specialist about this topic." He said, "It doesn't matter how expensive it'll be, how much licenses will cost, especially for the old technology that's everywhere and still runs on Windows 2000 or XP. Switching all of that over to a different operating system is not going to happen." And then I just responded saying that there was going to be quite a bit of a cluster with trying to get all of this stuff up and running. And then they also said that with Linux, there isn't going to be all the software available that we use now, which means they're going to have to find alternatives, or they're going to have to figure out how to run VMs and figure out how to use the software that way. They're going to have to retrain employees and then have to figure out Linux. So all of this different stuff. So I'm going to cover all of that in this video because, like I said, there's a lot of moving pieces to this. So let's go ahead and go through the backstory to all of this, because this isn't the first time that this has happened. And one of the things that I saw come up with a few different comments is, well, Munich tried this and then they moved back, and then they're actually moving. So they went from Windows to Linux, then back to Windows, and now they are going back to Linux. There's a whole story there, so we'll cover all of the backstory to all that stuff first. So that happened back in 2003, and the reason that Munich wanted to do that to begin with is because Microsoft was ending support for Windows NT. And for those who, all the old salts on the channel probably are aware of this. For those that aren't, Windows NT came out right after Windows 95, and it was meant for businesses. So think of Windows 95, except it was centered towards businesses, and then you had Windows 98 afterwards, and then there was Windows 2000, which was actually a really good operating system. Basically, you could look at Windows NT as kind of like an early version of Windows Enterprise or Windows Server or something like that. Anyway, so Microsoft was ending support for that, and the German government, so Munich at the time, was like, okay, well, we need to figure out something else. They wanted to switch to Linux. Now, they had about 15,000 computers at that time that they were going to switch over, and it kind of depends on where you look for the numbers on this. Some say like 16,000, some say 14,000, roughly in that range. And what they did is they came up with this project called Linux, and it was a combination of Linux and Munich. So they just made their own distro, and they actually rolled this out back in, I think it was 2006 or 2007, and the last update was in 2019, and they used this for quite a while. And what happened was, we'll kind of go through some articles here pretty soon. The dam kind of started to break in 2017, and something that people brought up in the comment section was that, well, the Microsoft ended up coming back over to Munich, and then all of this Linux stuff disappeared, so we'll go ahead and cover that here real quick. So this article is from 2004. It said Munich's Linux plans to attract international attention. This caught quite a bit of attention at the time because an entire section of a government said, you know what, we're getting rid of Windows completely. And there's this key point here to pay attention to, because this is going to become relevant later on in the video. Chief Executive Steve Ballmer reportedly interrupted a ski holiday in Switzerland to pay a personal visit to Munich's mayor. Now, later on, so this article came out in 2020, it said Linux, not Windows, why Munich is shifting back from Microsoft to open source again. And there were quite a few different things that came up around this time. There were allegedly some complaints that came up regarding the software that was being, so like Linux and all of the open source software being used, that people were complaining about it, things weren't working out well. Seems like that wasn't really the case. And what the city council said was, well, it comes down to cost efficiency. because, well, it's costing us a whole bunch of extra money to run Linux, despite the fact that you're not paying for licensing fees and ongoing support from Microsoft, all of this other stuff. And they said, well, there's complaints coming in about the lack of the software available. There's issues with compatibility for the software, and the users are generally unhappy with using Linux. Now, the head of the IT for Munich, the IT director, whatever his title was at that time, was Karl-Heinz Schneider, said that things were actually fine. There wasn't really any more volume of support tickets or anything like that than normal than they would have had with using Windows, and that the government of Munich had saved about 10 million euros in total as a result of going from Windows to Linux. Now, Microsoft came along later and countered this claim, saying, well, that's just not possible. Now, the other thing that I'm going to point out here, so they started using this it was back around 2006 or 2007 when they started rolling out the Linux. It was a really slow rollout. If you look through the timeline, I wasn't going to pull all of this stuff up because we're going to get to the current situation. This is just a brief overview. It took them quite a while to switch all of this stuff over, and they didn't have a huge team in IT working on this, which is one of the reasons that it takes so long. You have to completely reinstall everything. You have to train all of the users. It's a very long process. I was involved in similar stuff with IT work before. When you introduce new software to a large group of people, just the training alone is a huge aspect of that, and it takes a long time to get people up to speed on the new stuff. And even if it's just something simple, I'm telling you, there's a lot more work that is involved with that than people might think. And then as far as compatibility and users being unhappy, there was a period of quite a few years in between here where they had already been using Linux, and things were working out fine. So then what ended up happening was in 2018, so around 2017 was when Microsoft moved their headquarters back to Munich. Now, I'm not very familiar with how the German government system works over there. Their cities use something called a Lord Mayor, I believe it was. There was some suspicion that he may have been involved in some sort of a deal with Microsoft to switch the government, him and the city council, to switch the computers back over to using Windows. And so in 2018, Investigate Europe ended up making a documentary on this. They went and spoke to workers. The workers said, oh, well, the systems were fine. So there's no official story, no official statement regarding all of this stuff that, well, no, we actually moved back because we got to pay off Microsoft. By the way, I'm not saying that's what happened. Let's just say that when you have something that looks like shit and it smells like shit, it's probably shit. And the move back, so moving from Linux back to Microsoft cost about 86 million euros. And so Microsoft, or rather Munich, is looking at switching back over to Linux and using open source software. And it sounded like, I was looking at one article, it said it sounds like they're going to look sometime around the 2026 timeframe, I think, is when Munich wants to start switching back. But now the problem is that it's wasted a whole bunch of taxpayer money, wasted a bunch of time and effort doing this. There's a lot of moving pieces to this that complicates everything. So like I said, you have to have the IT teams roll over everything. So they went from Windows to Linux, then they moved back to Windows, now they have to go back to Linux. So you have all that time of setting up all of the infrastructure, then you have to train all of the users, you've had all of the user turnover, all of the employee turnover. Now, there's some people that still work in Munich that were familiar with the system before, so it's not going to be as much of a process, but still, there's a lot of wasted time and money as a result of them doing this. And pretty much everyone, again, I'm not making any official comment here, but it's pretty clear that there was some sort of bullshit involved in switching from Linux back to Windows. And I'll talk about this on a separate video because it's going to be a little bit of a rant. It'll be an educational rant because I want all of my videos to have some sort of a takeaway. But the European Union right now specifically is really getting fed up with a lot of big tech. And I'll talk about that in that video specifically, cover the different aspects of that. I think for this time, what we're going to see is that things are just going to switch over for good. And there were some comments that came up. I've seen it in both the posts that I made, and I've also seen it in some of these articles. Well, this stuff will never happen. They'll do what Munich did and switch back, or they just won't even start at all, or things are going to get so complicated that they'll just stop the whole project partway through it. I really don't think that's the case. I really do believe that the government is going to stick to this. So not only is Munich switching back, this German state is switching back as well. This Schleswig-Holstein. I'm sure if I'm pronouncing that wrong, someone in the comment section will correct me. Now, what's happening is they're switching 30,000 employees over. So this is going to be a pretty significant ordeal for the IT team. Now, there's a few things that go along with that. First of all, there's no word yet on if they're going to be using something like Linux, if they're just going to use whatever Munich is using already, or if they're going to make a fork of that, or maybe they'll end up switching to RHEL, which is Red Hat Enterprise Linux for those not familiar, or SUSE for both the distro and the support. Given that there's a lot more devices involved this time, I could potentially see them going with a company like RHEL or SUSE just for the support aspect of it. Now, something I'll mention with support, because those that haven't worked in IT before probably hear the word support and they mostly just think of help desk. They think, oh, well, okay, if you have a problem with Linux, then you just call up Red Hat or SUSE and say, hey, I've got this problem. But it goes way beyond just help desk. So in these companies, for example, so if you take a business, let's say a business is running Windows and they want to switch everything over to Linux, what you can do is go sign a contract with one of these companies. They have their own solutions architects in there who come in, they work with the company engineers, your engineers, and they'll say, okay, well, here's what we need to do. They'll come up with a rollout plan. They'll figure out all of the software issues that everyone's going to encounter ahead of time, and they will work to make sure it's a smooth transition over. Support goes way, way beyond just the help desk aspect of things. Now, there's multiple reasons that, like I said, I covered this a little bit already. There's multiple reasons that they're going over. First of all, there's the fact that the hardware requirements, this was something that they mentioned, the government mentioned, was that the hardware requirements for Windows 11, which have been increasing, by the way, Microsoft just recently announced, it was a month or two ago, that there's some sort of a CPU feature. It's years old at this point, but they are updating Windows 11 now to the newest version where if you don't have the CPU feature, then you just cannot run Windows 11 at all, which creates some issues, and I'll cover that here pretty soon. But the government said, hey, you know what? We're not going to get locked in. We're not going to have... The issue is when you do stuff like that, it's increasing e-waste, and it just wastes more of the taxpayer dollars, and it increases the overall cost. It's completely unnecessary for Windows to be locked down so much. Now, the other aspect, and they covered this as well, they said the other reason that they want to move over is because of the increased security with Linux. And I'm sure people have kind of noticed a theme with my channel here, but this is going to become a lot more important over the next few years, especially with the social engineering, the deep fakes, and the audio, using AI to create a fake voice that sounds real where you get a recording of someone, and it's already being used against people. And in fact, just yesterday or the day before, as of the time of me filming this video, there was an unsuccessful attempt where someone was posing as the CEO of LastPass and they tried to social engineer one of the employees. This stuff is going on constantly. And the fact is, I mean, the fact of the matter is Linux is just better at handling security than Windows. And if any Windows fans come in here and get butthurt at me saying that, here's the thing, like I'm using Windows right now, but it's just the way that it is. And the other big aspect to this is data collection is also becoming a lot worse. Now, I don't know how many people are aware of this. This was a big thing back when this article first released. So the German BSI, I don't know what the pronunciation of it is. It's the Federal Office for Information Security. They released this big article a while back. It covered all of the different aspects of the telemetry or spying inside of Windows. And at the time they did it, Windows was not nearly as bad as it is now. Like Windows 11 has gotten a lot worse. And so they were doing all this testing in here. And one of the things they talked about was the group policy settings for decreasing the amount of telemetry that's collected on these computers. And so for example, so if you are on Windows Home Edition, it always runs at full telemetry. You have absolutely no control over that unless you choose to block it using something like Simple Wall or something like Portmaster with block lists to block the specific telemetry section. And at the time this was released, there was 422 different points of data collection that was happening. And enhanced, which if you're running Windows Pro, you can go into the group policy and turn the setting down to enhanced, or maybe it's basic. It's been a while since I've played around with the settings, but you can see it barely decreases the amount of telemetry that's being collected. And if you're on Windows Enterprise, then you can turn it down to the least amount of telemetry connected, which is the 4 different points. Now, that was at the time back when Windows 10, if you've ever used group policy, by the way, there used to be 2 settings in Windows 10 when you'd go in there, 2 settings for telemetry, so it was really easy to just toggle off all of the telemetry. Then what happened is, because I was using Windows 10 a few months back, and I noticed what they did is they went and updated all of the telemetry settings in group policy, and it's also this way in Windows 11, where now there's about 30 different settings. You have to go in and toggle all this shit off in order to turn off all the telemetry. So it's gotten a lot worse, and it's going to continue to get worse. Again, I'll cover it in the video later on, talking about the issues with Microsoft right now. But this data collection is going to get worse because now everything's having this AI, this LLM built into it. You've got Copilot that's being built in. It's already built into the latest versions of Windows. There's obvious data concerns regarding that. And even other governments have an issue with this data collection. So the other thing, you could go Google this in your free time. There's this thing called DISA STIGs. It stands for Security Technical Implementation Guide. I don't remember what DISA stands for. So on US government computers, there's a set of guidelines, basically playbooks that these government computers have to follow in order to be properly configured. So for example, you cannot just throw Windows on a US government computer. There's a whole bunch of settings that have to be changed to increase the security and privacy. One of the things that they mentioned early on in the STIGs, there's like 400 or 500 different action items that have to be done. It's close near to the top where telemetry is listed, and they say, well, this has to be turned off. It's obvious that it's a privacy issue. And I already covered the AI, so I'm not going to cover that more. Now, some more stuff that I'm going to talk about here. So generally speaking, the comments that I was saying, the negative comments towards all of that, could be summed up with this one comment. I wasn't going to screenshot the person's name because I didn't want anyone to go brigade this person, but I'll read off what they said. As someone who dislikes Microsoft immensely, I still have to say this is almost certainly going to waste more time and money than just sticking with Microsoft products. If your PCs can't run Windows 11, they're already ancient crap. Users have also generally already know how to use Windows and Office 365. The cost of IT training, deployment, and user training cannot possibly make this a good value proposition. Now, first of all, I'm going to cover this aspect right here. If your PCs can't run Windows 11, they're ancient crap. So let me give you, I've posted about these kind of computers before in the community posts. You can go find these used office computers on eBay for about 50 to 100 bucks. You could get a fairly newer one for 200 to 300 bucks, one that's a few years old, and these things run great. Now, this one particular one that I have, I've bought a lot of these things, by the way, just to have them as different test beds for things. This one in particular is 13 years old now. And what I did is I wanted to test out Windows 11. It runs Windows 10 great, by the way. And I thought, okay, well, test out Windows 11 because you can turn off the forced checks for the TPM and secure boot. So I went and did that, and I was running some tests on it. Windows 11 runs really good on this computer. The idea that computers have to be brand new or within a few years old or they are just worthless is absolutely ridiculous. Now, this computer here, you're certainly not going to be able to play games on it or run Adobe Premiere or anything like that. It doesn't have the power to do it, but it could absolutely do pretty much anything inside of an office environment just fine, even a computer that's this old. And I suspect that Germany does not want to throw out upwards of 30,000 computers over the coming years just to keep pace with the updates that Microsoft is making. And potentially something Microsoft might do with Windows 12 is require CPUs that have these AI components built in. This is a new thing that's happening with CPUs now where they're building in all of this AI garbage where if you have this on your CPU, it'll run the LLM faster on your machine. And no one knows for sure if Microsoft's going to make that a requirement. But my impression was the way that this was worded on the news release from the German government is they, you know what, we're not even going to potentially be dealing with this as a problem. Now, this is a valid critique right here, to be fair to this person. This is very true. So users, it says users generally know how to use Windows and Office 365, the cost of IT training, deployment, all this, et cetera, et cetera. This is a thing where it's going to take a while to pay off, but it's not just about the cost. Again, it's about these other aspects as well, not having to throw out computers that are still good, security and privacy. This, of everything here, deployment is going to be really challenging. The training both the IT department and the users is what's going to make this very difficult. Now, many places have gone before and done it. Munich has already done it, and that was back when Linux did not have nearly as much polish as it does now. Windows has improved tremendously over the past, even just the past few years now, because a lot more people are starting to move over. And then a lot of web apps, so a lot of places, governments and companies are moving to web apps. So you just log on to a browser, you go to whatever it is that you need to do on the browser, that's whatever the web app is, like Office 365, for example, so you can use all of the Microsoft Office tools online. You don't even need to install them on your computers. A lot of things have moved towards web apps now. And the case where you really won't find web apps being used is for things that are extremely sensitive. So like classified information, for example. I don't know if this government handles any sort of really ultra sensitive information. So they're not going to have web apps for things like that. So they might have a little bit of compatibility issues moving from Windows to Linux. But otherwise, this really is not that big of a deal. This is going to be the hardest part right here. So now I'll just give you a quick story to all of this. Also, let me point out one other thing here. And for some reason, Statista, I was able to load this up and use it earlier, and then when I came back to it later, it says, well, you need an account for unlimited access. So just to give you an idea here, Windows is really starting to lose the battle, and part of it's probably because they're losing the plot. They're making changes to Windows that they think people want, but they don't actually want, and they're trying to force all of this goofy-ass garbage. Not too long ago, I think it was 4, 5, 6 months back, they're talking about potentially removing the start menu from Windows again. So we're going to go through all of this issue with Windows 8 where we had that problem. No one wants this, but all of these higher ups at Microsoft they're making these decisions thinking that this is what people want. And it's the same thing as these game developers. I'm seeing a lot more news recently about these game companies that they'll release a AAA game that they spent tens or even $100+ million working on. It completely flops and they lose a bunch of money. And it's because they think they know the user better than the user knows themselves, and that we're going to make this change and they're going to like it. This is a result of what happens here. So the blue line is Microsoft. Now this started at 2013. This goes up until Q1 of this year. So back in early 2023, Windows had dipped down to 62% from 76. So they had dropped 14% in a very short period of time. Now they've gone up a little bit, but the fact of the matter is, and then if you look at Linux for the longest time has floated between around 1 to 2%. And then from 2022 up until currently, they have grown to just a little over 4% in market share. Now that might not sound like a lot. That is a significant number when you take into account that there's probably several billion desktop computer users. That's a pretty significant portion of people. And what this is the dam is breaking and things are going to move. And that's something I'll give more context to in the Windows video that I'm going to make. But people are really getting fed up with the way that Windows is going. They're tired of these changes being forced on them. And AI is presenting a significant problem for them because they think this is what people want. But the vast majority of people do not want AI baked into their operating system because they are aware of the significant privacy concerns that go along with it. So let me give you an idea. So for the people that have never worked in IT before, some of you on this channel are looking at getting into IT, or maybe you don't have any interest in getting into IT, but you're just here for some education on this topic. So one of the organizations that I worked at a while back wanted to switch a couple things over. First of all, we had a couple of ISPs. You should always have a failover depending on how critical internet is for your organization, because every now and then internet will go down. So we had a failover. So we were switching ISPs, which by itself wasn't really that big of a deal. We had some issues there. I'll cover that here pretty soon. And then we were also switching over all of a router. So we used a couple different brands of routers. One of them was Cradlepoint, which I will say I actually really liked Cradlepoint. I thought these routers worked really damn well. Now, the reason that we were getting rid of Cradlepoint at the time is we needed to, basically our support contract was ending for all of our devices. We were looking at having to swap a lot of hardware out. And so it was basically spend tens of thousands of dollars replacing all of these. The entry price point for Cradlepoint is right around $1,500. That's not including the support contracts that come with them that you have to pay every year. Otherwise you won't get updates or like continual updates, security updates, or support if you have some sort of an issue with it. Basically, you need the support contracts. It's just how the business IT side of things work. And so I was told that we needed to find a different we needed to find an alternative to these to try and cut down on the budget. And then we were cutting down on the budget from the ISP aspect of it. Now, I also liked our ISP. We had an enterprise account that I was the administrator for. And this is a lesson for those of you who are looking to get into IT. You may be asked to do something like this at some point. I'm going to say this right now. Just because price and value are not the same thing, just because something has a lower price point does not mean that it is a better value. And what I have found is that a lot of times it is the complete opposite. And so what we did is we went to a much cheaper router, and they weren't the worst things ever. Like, they worked decently, but we had a lot of problems with them. For some reason, we had significant overheating problems with them. We had connectivity issues with them. Really, they were just kind of turds. They were just really average. It was something that it would be fine for a home user to use, but it was not acceptable to be using in a business environment. And then the ISP, so we were doing a demo with the ISP, and I was testing that to make sure that it was going to work with all of our equipment and that the speeds were good. And what we got was really good speeds initially, and I thought, okay, well, I knew that we were going to have some issues with the support side of things, which I didn't have to contact ask the support side of people very often for the ISP, because I could just manage everything. I was the administrator, so it was pretty easy to take care of any issues. It was very rare for us to have any sort of an issue with the ISP that we needed to deal with. So we made both of these switches over, both from the routers that we were using and over to the ISP, to try to save a little bit of money. Now, what happened was we had a whole bunch of complications once we switched the ISP. I don't know if they did this for the demo connection that we were using, and then they just decided to give us a really dog shit connection afterwards. But what we noticed was the performance just absolutely tanked. We were having a lot of issues. We needed to upload and download a ton of data just about all day, every day. And I was talking with support, and I said, I don't know what the hell's going on with our speeds, but we're having these issues. I cannot figure out, there's nothing wrong on our end of things. And their support was terrible. In the previous ISP, the rare times that I needed to contact them, the support was great. Now, the process of switching all of this stuff over was it was a process. I spent and wasted so much time switching all of this stuff over. And by the time we got everyone trained on using the new hardware, because I did have to train people, okay, here's how you use this hardware. If there's some sort of an issue with it, here's how you fix it. I was getting phone calls after hours. Hey, we're having an issue with the router. The internet's gone out, all the et cetera, et cetera. Things were just an absolute pain in the ass. And that was for a small rollout. That was absolutely nowhere near having to switch 30,000 people over to a completely different operating system and train them how to use a new operating system. Because teaching people, okay, here's a few common issues you'll have with these new routers that we have, or some internet issues you might run into. That is a much smaller aspect of user training that you have to deal with, compared to, hey, we're switching from Windows to Linux, we're switching from Microsoft Word and Excel over to LibreOffice. So the point of all that is, when you scale that out, a lot of stuff is going to break. They are going to run into a lot of roadblocks. This is really the only thing that could potentially jam it up. Either this or someone that's higher up in the government, or multiple people end up taking a payoff from Microsoft. Again, I'm not saying that that is going to happen, but it's really the only legitimate reason that I could see that happening, where they end up going back to using Windows. Because I do think there's a strong commitment here to switch everything over to open source. Anyway, that is going to wrap the video up. If you have any questions on anything, drop them down below. I'll be making that Microsoft. There's a lot of aspects to the Microsoft thing that I'm talking about. It would have gone out of the scope of this video, but it will be an interesting video when that comes out, because it'll be a little bit of a rant about the current state of Microsoft, the current state of Windows, and why we are going to need to move over to Linux eventually, because there's a lot of different aspects to that. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video and you got something useful out of this. I appreciate support as always, and with that being said, I will see you next Friday.